So this is testing. This is the English. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is me in the English channel. That's good. Okay, thank you.
We welcome the delegation.
Upholding of the key pillars of Far Samoa.
With disabilities. Thank you, Mr.
In all relevant decision-making processes and government
of migrants and refugees are respected on the justification that the current asylum and migration legislation adequately ensures that the recommendations are met. Contrary to this assertion, in 2015, Hungary amended its asylum law to declare a crisis situation caused by mass migration and swiftly criminalized any entry through its borders. In addition, law criminalizes the work of civil society organizations or lawyers that work to assist migrants. Finally, the ICJ regrets that Hungary has not accepted the recommendations on the ratification of the optional protocols to the ICESCR and the CRC. I thank you.
Thank you. Action Canada for Population and Development has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Action Canada makes this statement on behalf of People Opposing Patriarchy Association and the Sexual Rights Initiative. We regret that Hungary noted the sole recommendation it received on comprehensive sexuality education and that it did not receive any recommendations on access to safe abortion and contraception. Hungary is one of the few countries in the EU in which emergency contraception is only available with a prescription. We call on Hungary to make emergency contraception available without prescription and to subsidize access to contraception. Additionally, compulsory counselling prior to abortion must be abolished, or as a minimum first step, the content and practice of counselling must stop violating pregnant women's dignity. Instead, it should provide balanced and scientifically correct information to support each woman in making an informed decision rather than to manipulate and humiliate her. We call on Hungary to ensure access to safe abortion, including medical abortion. Similarly, obstetric violence, including painful, unnecessary, and intrusive interventions and humiliating treatment, must also be eliminated. Unnecessary and non-consensual interventions and disrespectful treatment are extremely common. We call on Hungary to put in place accountability mechanisms and protocols to safeguard pregnant women's human rights. We call on Hungary to provide a comprehensive sexuality and relationship education that is equality-oriented, focuses on mutual consent, aims to prevent intimate partner and sexual violence, supports informed sexual and reproductive decisions for girls and women of all ages, and also emphasizes boys' and men's responsibility in preventing STIs and using contraception. The Education for Family Life curriculum currently in place entrenches harmful gender stereotypes. Hungary must stop the reinforcement of such stereotypes. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Cívicus.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cívicus welcomes the government of Hungary engagement with the UPR process. Since its last review, Hungary failed to implement any of the 33 recommendations relating to civic space. We regret that Hungary accepted just 13 of the 31 civic space recommendations it received during this cycle. Space for civil society is increasingly being restricted in Hungary. Civil society organizations have faced ongoing attempts to restrict their funding. Although the government repealed the Lex NGO foreign funding law, which was declared unlawful by the European Court of Justice in June 2020, it adopted a new law that threatens the work of NGOs by permitting the State Audit Office to selectively audit NGOs which have a budget that exceeds 20 million forints. The ongoing erosion of LGBTQI+ rights remain a concern, with the government passing several restrictive pieces of legislation which directly target LGBTQI+ people. These have resulted in limiting freedom of expression and association for LGBTQI+ focused civil society organizations. Media independence has been repeatedly threatened as a result of ongoing political influence over Hungary's media regulatory bodies, with the government's control over the National Media and Communications Authority and its Media Council, resulting in diminishing space for independent media. We particularly regret that Hungary did not accept recommendations to take specific measures to ensure media freedom. Independent media have frequently been denied access to information. However, this practice has further worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic. A recent investigation revealed that the government used Pegasus spyware to surveil investigative journalists. Mr. President, Cívicus calls on the government of Hungary to take concrete steps to address these concerns. including by withdrawing restrictive legislation and amendments that restrict the activities of civil society organizations and their funding, and refraining from obstructing the work of independent journalists. We thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Misan, Center for Human Rights.
Thank you, President. We commend the report of the Working Group on the Universal Periodic Review of Hungary, and while looking forward to its adoption, we would like to address the issue of migration, which is one of the most serious challenges Hungary is currently facing. While we welcome all the measures taken by the Asylum Authority to improve the reception conditions for asylum seekers, we remain concerned about Hungary's procedure in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, asylum seekers were deprived of the right to access fair and efficient asylum procedures. Furthermore, in 2018, Hungary's government introduced the Stop Sorrows laws, which make it a criminal offense for individuals to help migrants and refugees apply for asylum. This came after the creation of a razor wire barrier on its border with Serbia and Croatia, where over 1 million people entered the EU. In doing so, Hungary has failed to fulfill its EU obligations. We are also deeply concerned by the introduction of a 25% tax imposed on financial support for activities promoting immigration to Hungary. In early 2018, the ministry withdrew all tenders under the fund. Several NGOs that had previously received funding for projects providing humanitarian support to migrants and refugees no longer receive any funds. Therefore, Mizan and Geneva International Center for Justice call on the Hungarian government to ratify the Global Compact for Migration and remove restrictions that prevent access to the national asylum system, and to review its national legislation on migration and refugees to ensure that it is consistent with international law norms and ensures full respect for the principle of non-refoulement. Thank you.
Thank you. Y como último orador.
Thank you. And the last speaker that we can accommodate because of the technical problem, the video of a minority rights group was interrupted because of a technical problem, so that in order to ensure participation of all stakeholders, we will roll that video once again, please. Minority rights group.
Gracias.
I speak on behalf of Ide Tartozunk Egyesület and Minority Rights Group, two organizations active in promoting achievement of minority rights, equality, and non-discrimination of Roma in Hungary. We particularly welcome the government of Hungary's acceptance of Recommendation 160-171, put forward by 12 countries that called on Hungarian authorities to secure access to education and to combat segregation of Roma children in schools. Segregation in education and documented in the context of fines related to COVID restrictions. Thank you.
Thank you. Este ha sido el último orador.
Thank you. That was the last speaker that we could accommodate. Before I give the floor to the delegation of Hungary for concluding remarks, allow me to note that based on the information provided, out of 267 recommendations received, 131 enjoyed the support of Hungary and 136 are noted. I give the floor to His Excellency Peter Starai, the Secretary of State within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Hungary.
Tiene 2 minutos.
You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this opportunity, having convened this meeting today. I would like also to express our gratitude to most of the member states who have intervened and who have delivered cooperative contributions with regard to our UPR. At the same time, we regret that especially some of the NGOs have not based their interventions on real facts, but on allegations and on politically motivated concepts. I can assure you that Hungary did its best to accept as many recommendations as possible, but there were cases where we were not in a position to accept these recommendations, and the reasons were different. There were several reasons for that. One was that they were contradicting our basic law, which did not make it possible for us to accept the recommendation. The other reason was sometimes that the recommendations were already or had already been implemented. And the third reason was that some recommendations were politically motivated and not based on facts. But all in all, also in these cases, we tried to do our best, and we submitted our written extensive answers to clarify the situations with regard to the questions and the recommendations. Mr. Chairman, thank you once again, and I wish you all good work and good health and peace everywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate very much the constructive participation of Hungary and also the presence at the highest level in this UPR. And so now I propongo ahora que el Consejo adopte la...
I now propose that the Council adopt the decision on the outcome of the Universal Periodic Review of Hungary as it appears on the screen.
La decisión está...
I see no objection. The decision is on the screen. I propose that this be adopted. I see no objection. The decision is adopted. We will briefly suspend the meeting before proceeding with the consideration of the outcome of Suriname.
Gracias.
Thank you. That was the last speaker that we could accommodate. Before I return the floor to Suriname for them to make concluding remarks, allow me to note that based on the information provided, of 147 recommendations received, 124 enjoy the support of Suriname and 22 have been noted. Additional clarification was provided on one recommendation, indicating which part of the recommendation was supported and which part was noted. I now give the floor to His Excellency for concluding remarks. You have the floor.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Mr. President, distinguished representatives, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the government and people of the Republic of Suriname, I wish to express our appreciation to you, President, for the cooperation and skillful leadership of this meeting. We thank all distinguished representatives and other stakeholders for the constructive spirit of discussions in the working group and the contribution to this process towards improving the various aspects of human rights. The pledges and commitments made by Suriname during this UPR cycle reflect the importance that the government of Suriname attaches to the promotion and protection of all human rights. The government of Suriname strongly commits to implementing the recommendations that have been supported during this cycle and will work towards addressing remaining challenges. In this regard, I wish to reiterate that the cooperation with various national stakeholders and international partners, including the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, will be continued and further strengthened. In closing, Mr. President, the Republic of Suriname reiterates its full commitment to the promotion and protection of all human rights, the promotion of democracy, good governance, and strengthening of the rule of law as a fundamental framework for economic prosperity, sustained peace, and international cooperation.
I thank His Excellency for that presentation and for the constructive participation of Suriname.
Comentario adicional.
An additional comment? Please, you have the floor.
Supported the recommendation to ratify the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. We are currently studying this convention and its effects. Suriname is currently implementing indictments given by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the cases of the Samaka people and others. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Agradezco su
I thank His Excellency for the constructive participation and presence here in this meeting. I now propose that the Council adopt the decision on the outcome of the Universal Periodic Review of Suriname as it appears on the screen.
No veo.
I see no objection. The decision is adopted. We will briefly suspend the meeting before proceeding with the consideration of the outcome of Samoa.
Procederemos ahora a la consideración del.
We will now proceed with the consideration of the outcome of Samoa based on the report of the Working Group on the Universal Periodic Review of Samoa. This document, together with the additional information that will now be provided by Samoa, will constitute the outcome of the review and shall be adopted by the Council through a standardized decision. It is my honor to give the floor to Ms. Peseta Namayasimi, Executive Head of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade of Samoa, for her to present additional information on the review. Madam, you have the floor via Zoom.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, Samoa wishes to again express its appreciation to the Troika and the Secretariat for their work in facilitating our review. We'd also like to thank all member states for their participation through their advanced questions and recommendations, constructive feedback and acknowledgement of the work Samoa has done in the implementation of our human rights recommendations. We appreciate your participation and engagement in this process. In particular, we would like to thank all our national stakeholders that were actively involved and contributed to our responses to the recommendations, government ministries, civil society organizations, NGOs, NHRI, and our development partners. We count on the same enthusiasm and active engagement in taking forward the recommendations that we've received from this third review cycle. Mr. President, we're pleased to inform that out of the 145 recommendations, Samoa has adopted 112 and noted the rest. We reiterate that all recommendations, whether supported or noted, are part of our implementation plans, which are now underway. We'd like to provide a brief summary of recommendations by thematic areas. Under the cluster of international obligations, SAMO has accepted 25 of the 30 recommendations received. Our recent efforts under this area include our ratification of CRPD and accession to UNCAT. And although we've yet to ratify the second optional ICCPR protocol, SAMO has already abolished the death penalty and remains committed in its efforts to ratifying all core human rights treaties and their protocols in due course. And we have included this as part of our monitoring task force. And their work plan for 2022. Samoa has accepted all recommendations under the National Human Rights Framework Cluster. Work for Samoa's overdue human rights reports are now underway with the assistance of OCHA and SPC, noting that drafts have been completed. Under the Equality and Non-Discrimination Cluster, Samoa accepts the recommendation to combat discrimination and violence against women and children, and notes the 15 recommendations regarding legislation on sexual orientation, gender identity, and same-sex relations. We've accepted most of the recommendations under the cluster development, the environment, business, and human rights, and have noted the recommendation to develop a national action plan to promote human rights in business activities. In the area of administration of justice, Samoa accepts recommendations to ensure the independence of the judiciary and to continue efforts in strengthening its human rights training and programs for law enforcement officers, and notes recommendations concerning the minimum age of criminal responsibility. On the prohibition of all forms of slavery, Samoa accepts the recommendation to enhance legislation and enforcement on human trafficking for sex sexual and labor exploitation, and notes the recommendation to strengthen legal and policy frameworks that address trafficking. Under the cluster, the right to work, Samoa accepts the recommendation to guarantee the rights of all workers, specifically to guarantee freedom of association and collective agreement. Samoa accepts all 5 recommendations under the cluster of adequate standard of living, the pathway for the development of Samoa 2021 to 2025 was launched early this month with its vision of fostering social harmony, safety, and freedom for all. Samoa also launched the agreement signing of the 2 million tala shelter financing assistance last month, and this program aims to boost livelihoods of the most vulnerable families, including building secure shelters for home, improving living conditions, and providing proper sanitation facilities, as well as equipping families without access to water with water tanks to better adapt to natural disasters and emergencies. Under the cluster of right to health, Samoa accepts 12 of the 15 recommendations, including to develop health services, implements legislative reforms that guarantee universal access to health services, improve access to health care, especially for women in rural services, promote health education, awareness and services, and eliminate the age limit for testing for HIV and STIs. Samoa notes all other recommendations regarding legislation for transgender persons and decriminalizing abortion, including the voluntary interruption of pregnancy. Samoa accepts all 3 recommendations under the right to education. And under the cluster of the rights of women, Samoa accepted 30 recommendations and noted the recommendation to establish a community legal aid center for women. Of the 12 recommendations under the cluster on the rights of the child, Samoa accepted 8 recommendations that includes increasing measures in combating violence and sexual exploitation of children. Samoa notes the recommendation to raise the age of criminal responsibility for children, prohibit corporal punishment in all settings, and amend existing laws to prohibit all forms of child labor. And as mentioned in our report, we have policies and legislation pending cabinet approval that will address some of these recommendations, and wish to reiterate our commitment to the protection of children and their rights. Lastly, under the cluster of the rights of persons with disabilities, Samoa accepts 5 of the 6 recommendations. These look to improve accessibility as well as to improve the quality of life for persons with disabilities. Samoa notes the recommendations to ensure that the Mental Health Act 2007 fully complies with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Thank you, Mr. President.
Le agradezco por su presentación y celebro.
Thank you. I want to thank you for that presentation. Particularly welcome the fact that the modalities that we've adopted in this council, which enable virtual participation, we've been able to, thanks to that, we've had